The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Network Collective's latest webinar on the topic of is internet cheaper than MPLS in the UK? My name is John Waterhouse. I'm CEO of the Network Collective, and I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. As I'm sure everyone joining knows, TNC is the UK's largest independent network and telecoms strategy and sourcing consultancy, supporting over 260 of the UK's largest organisations with commercial, technical and operational activities around the network and telecom services. Joining me today is our head of consulting, Adrian Joyce. Adrian, do you want to say hello to our listeners?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Right, before we get stuck into the meat of the webinar, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. So we are going to be very strict on sticking to our 20-minute window. Everyone joining will have access to a recording of the webinar afterwards, and we will try to respond to any questions at the end, but any we don't have time to respond to, we will answer on email afterwards. Right, so the reason we prepared this webinar was based on the huge interest we had on a white paper we wrote at the end of 2018 about this topic. And it seems to be a huge question for an awful lot of organisations. Can they save money by migrating from MPLS to internet services for their UK connectivity requirements? So what we really wanted to do with the white paper and with this webinar is really deep dive down into exactly that topic. And as always, you know, with these hot industry topics, we want to use our vendor and our solution independence to cut through all of the nonsense and all the sales and marketing messages and really get to the bottom of this question and what the potential costs and benefits really are. So, 4 key things we're going to focus on today. Are there savings to be made? If so, why? If not, why not? How does the position in the UK compare to the position globally? And finally, what does the future hold? Now, just as a quick point, as I think everyone listening knows, TNC leads more procurement processes for more organisations for these types of services.
I believe we might have lost John there, I'm sorry to say. So apologies if that's the case. I'm hoping he will come back online shortly.
Can you hear me, Adrian?
Oh, you are back. Lovely. Thanks, John. We lost you there for about 30 seconds. Apologies to everyone.
Okay. So the question I was saying was, look at the slide on the screen. Can you talk us through why organisations may have felt or may feel that they can make savings by migrating connectivity from MPLS to internet in the UK?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. You touched on a key point in your introduction there, John. That's with regards to marketing. I think marketing has had a lot of influence on this topic over the last few years. So clearly, SD-WAN technology has been a considerable interest in the market. Considerable marketing has gone into it, and some of that marketing has predicated cost saving as a benefit of SD-WAN. Now, we've done other webinars, white papers on SD-WAN, so I don't propose we go into the details and the benefits of that. But I just wanted to focus briefly on that message of cost saving. So some of the marketing has said, move to SD-WAN, save money. And the basis of that has been move from traditional expensive MPLS to cheap and cheerful internet services and save money. And therefore, the messages that are getting heard and listened to by CIOs, IT directors, network managers, procurement people has generally been, oh, I can save money by going to the internet. Now, our experience is that you can save money by going to the internet, but generally this has been across international markets. However, when we look at the UK market, we don't see those savings. We do not see, as you said, John, we procure scores of networks every year, and we do not see any differentiation in the pricing between internet services and traditional MPLS services, like for like, in the UK. So I think that's the crux of the issue there, John.
Excellent. Sorry, I lost you for quite a while there, Adrian. So I'm assuming you've just finished talking about the slide entitled "Are there savings to be made?"
Yeah, and just focusing on the two things: the experience that both we and other people have in terms of globally going out to buy internet is cheaper. So that's one source of evidence for our listeners. The other being the SD-WAN marketing that has suggested the same. But what we see as different is that, yes, we do see those savings internationally, but we see no difference in the UK between internet and MPLS pricing, which, you know, obviously for the next few slides is quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So could you explain to us why that is the case? And in particular, I think you're going to draw a differentiation between Ethernet services and DSL services.
Yeah, so as I say, if you look at Ethernet pricing, when we run procurement processes, when we receive pricing for both internet and Ethernet at an equivalent bandwidth, we see little or no difference. And in fact, and again, slightly counterintuitively, and again, we'll come on to the reasons why, we even see internet as being slightly more expensive, just marginally. The other area we do see a difference is in the DSL type services, and there are more consumer-like grade products that you can buy at a cheaper price than an enterprise grade DSL product. However, as the slide says, there are a number of compromises within those products that typically most enterprises don't like and aren't willing to take. There are then ways to mitigate some of these compromises, things such as contention, poor SLAs, etc. But the way to fix those issues is to actually buy add-ons to those products, so to enhance the care levels, for example, on the SLA. And by the time you pay for those, well, guess what? You're back at the same price that you would have bought your enterprise grade DSL into MPLS service. So
that's extremely interesting. So you said something a minute ago. I'm going to have to get you just to repeat it, just to make sure, because I think, you know, a lot of people listening will find it quite a surprise. You're saying, in fact, quite often we're seeing MPLS services as being cheaper than internet.
Yes, certainly in the last sort of 6 to 12 months. Previously, we were seeing them probably at the same cost level, but now we're seeing, and it's marginal, John. But when we run a process, it's the MPLS pricing that is by a nose ahead of any internet pricing.
So I think that may well surprise a lot of people, because I think that, you know, and obviously we know this from the work we do and the conversations we have with customers, there is this kind of view out there in the market that, hey, internet's cheap, MPLS is expensive. And to even talk about parity, I've seen, you know, people gasping at hearing that piece of information. I think if you said that it's actually even potentially that MPLS is cheaper, that would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, there is this assumption that internet is cheaper. It's easier for the managed WAN provider to hand off their data onto you know, effectively the public internet network, or the internet network of somebody else, rather than transport that data across their own core network as you would expect across MPLS. But the evidence is that's not the case. Not only the evidence that we see in the pricing, but when we speak to these vendors, both on the record and off the record, you know, they back that up and say, well, in actual fact, our core networks typically are paid off or substantially paid off, And when we hand off to the internet, we have to pay someone like Links to take that data on. So we have some hard external costs versus the costs of our own core network that typically have already been paid for many times over.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and obviously this next slide picks up on some of those points. Are there any of these points which we haven't touched on yet in terms of reasons why
Absolutely.
these commercial outputs are arising?
So I think if you look at the UK market as well, and compare it to some of the other markets around the world where you do see these differences in prices, what are the key differences? Well, the UK market is very competitive, has been very competitive for a long time. It's been deregulated for a long time. There are many aggressive vendors out there pushing the price points down, having their own core networks. If you look at the geography of the UK in terms of density of population, it's a very dense country. You've got lots of telecommunications equipment. Typically where our customers are is where people are. There'll always be the odd exceptions, the heavy industry, the power stations, the MOD land, things of that nature. But typically most organizations are near to population either for their customer base or for their employment base. So you've got quite a different geography to some countries out there. I think that all helps. So combine the two, the competitive nature of the market, deregulation, etc., with the geography, gives you this perhaps not unique, but certainly different from many countries that we see. I think beyond that, John, if we perhaps move to the next slide, if you take the reverse side of the coin and look at how people are buying global MPLS, now typically they're going to a global WAN provider who then in turn buys from a regional provider who may then in turn buy locally, or they're going to an aggregator. And what you find is that you've got a couple of things here. You've got a lack of economy of scale in the local country. You've got longer backhauling. You've also got you haven't got local procurement, so there's not an understanding of the local marketplace, languages, traditions, etc. there. Combine that again with different geography and perhaps less competitive markets, and you'll find that the buying experience to buy globally is different to buying locally in the UK for a large telco that perhaps is UK based already.
That's extremely interesting. I think one other point, just also to pick up on the drivers for that price similarity, and I'm going to quote you back at yourself, Adrian, which is always a dangerous thing. But there's you've mentioned before that we are seeing a drive from the telcos to increasingly see, particularly MPLS, as a platform product. They want to get customers onto that platform so they can sell additional services, whether that's telephony or security or other types of services, where perhaps the margin might be higher than in the transport market, which in fairness now is pretty commoditized. That incentivizes them to want to sell MPLS over internet as well, presumably.
Absolutely, and I think if you know, having worked inside a telco for many years in the past, keeping the money internal as well is also something that they will strive to do. If they've got to pay you know, an external cost to an underlying provider, you know, if they have to do it, they have to do it. But if they have a choice between utilizing their own core network or paying to use someone else's, well, even if they're at the same price, they'd rather keep that money internal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So going back to the comparison of UK and global, effectively what you're saying is that there are specific drivers, because we know from our experiences that a lot of customers on an international basis are seeing that big cost saving by switching from a globally or regionally, typically a globally sourced MPLS to a locally sourced internet. They are seeing those big savings, but obviously they're not seeing those savings then in the UK. And you're saying that's down to effectively the a more efficient procurement process, dealing with local specialists, gaining the economies of scale. Are those the key drivers for why that
absolutely.
occurring?
Absolutely. I think the other item perhaps it's worth addressing in the few minutes that we've got left, John, is perhaps why this perception that running your own core network is expensive. And, you know, we've talked about, well, it's probably the same cost. We haven't perhaps explored why. But when you look at the cost constituents of providing a service to a customer, you know, from the day of installation, you've got the account manager, you've got the lawyers, you've got the project manager, you've got the sales engineers, the technical engineers, the architects. All of these roles, all of these costs will be much the same, whether they're dealing with their internal core network or an external network. Then when you come to the hard costs of paying for internet connectivity versus keeping your core network running, we think they're quite a small element of the overall cost. They've probably spent far more on account managers' commissions and service managers' wages and NOC specialists and the products that they use to monitor the network than they're actually doing to maintain that core network. So actually the costs of providing an internet service versus the costs of providing traditional MPLS network are very, very similar. But the subtle difference is the minor elements of running your core network are maintained internally, you know, as opposed to giving it to links or to someone else for your, you know, your internet handover.
And presumably that extends even further. The CPE costs are going to be broadly the same. The access circuit is going to be the same. So all of those factors, the installation engineer, the vast majority of the costs associated with internet and MPLS, all the constituent parts are exactly the same.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay. Very, very interesting. Now, starting to get conscious of time. We've got a couple of minutes left.
I just, if we move on to the the summary slide there, I think it's worth just going through a couple of these points. So generally, as a result of this, we see very few organisations actually choosing wholesale in terms of across their network to buy internet services in the UK. Of course, there will be reasons to do it, local breakout. But again, the UK geography, relatively small. If you've got central breakout, you don't have geolocation issues, you don't really have latency issues. So we don't find, as a result perhaps of the lack of cost differential or the increased cost perhaps, organisations choosing to buy internet in the UK. That's the first point. I think then the second is to reinforce, we do however see it being done across global networks. So we're not saying that this isn't the case for other countries. Now, there may be some specific countries that are similar to the UK or have similar characteristics in terms of the pricing, maybe for different reasons, but it's not every country that you will choose to buy internet. I think this third point is really interesting. It's don't let either the SD-WAN marketing or your incumbent lead you down the path of, hey, this is the solution. I think it's very interesting, the UK market at the moment. MPLS pricing is pretty much in free fall. The price points that we're seeing for 10 meg, 100 meg, even gig services are staggeringly cheaper than we were seeing for lower bandwidth services 3, 4, 5 years ago. So if your incumbent vendor says to you, I can save you some money, whether it be through internet services or through a renewal, it's shocking how much more can be saved if you know I suppose, John, if you know what we know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So sorry, John.
No. So that's really interesting. I mean, you mentioned here about you know, particularly those cost reductions in Ethernet. 9 times out of 10, we're seeing organisations can, you know, who are looking for cost savings, can make those cost saving, can gain those cost savings without having to make the technology change away from MPLS. and particularly going back to your point from earlier about the potential service compromises of moving to the internet, they don't necessarily need to incur those service impacts. They can just gain the commercial benefit straight away by accessing lower MPLS pricing.
Yeah, and this is the challenge for many of our customers. You know, that someone in the organization has been, you know, well and truly marketed to by an SD-WAN company, or has heard, you know, seen use case studies internationally, assumes that will work for the UK, and turns around to our friends and our colleagues in these organizations and says, that's the solution, get me SD-WAN, save me money. Well, actually, then you've got to go back to that person and go, we don't need it. We might want it, you know, there are other benefits, but equally there can be additional costs. But actually, a simpler solution to that commercial challenge can be just a better informed renewal or a go-to-market for the same services.
And just wrapping up, looking at the futures, you've got a couple of bullets down at the bottom here. What you're saying is we don't see that changing. Now, obviously, you know, looking forwards is always a difficult thing, but, you know, for example, over the next 12 months, it seems like you're saying more of the same. Ethernet prices are going to keep going down. MPLS prices are going to keep coming down.
Absolutely.
We think this stands.
Yeah, so at the moment, Ethernet pricing, despite the impressive reductions over the last year, 2 years, even the latest figures we got in earlier this week again are showing decreases from a few weeks ago. So it almost beggars belief. Where will Ethernet pricing end up? You know, I think we'll get a lot more for less as time progresses, and I think the impact of 5G as an alternative to wired access will, you know, not be suitable for everyone. You know, there will be reasons why it will work for some and not others. You know, line of sight, contention, etc. But what it will do, and in some ways we've seen this with 4G, it will erode the bottom end of the Ethernet market, and it will probably also strongly challenge the ADSL2+, the fiber to the cabinet market as well. You know, the bandwidth, the speeds that you're going to get on 5G, the latency, and the potential to VPN to slice out some of that network are really interesting for the fixed WAN networks of today.
Very, very interesting, Adrian. Very interesting indeed. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on this, and I'm sure our listeners will have found it a very insightful listen. We have had some questions in. I'm sorry we had a couple of technical problems earlier on, so we'll respond to those on email, and since we've run out of time now, but just flick onto the last slide. So as everyone listening will know, these are topics that we find extremely interesting. We've obviously got a lot of information and insight to bring to the table. So if anyone would like to discuss the impact of these topics to them and their networks and connectivity, we'd be delighted to arrange one-on-one sessions to talk these topics through. And there we have to end. Adrian, thank you very much again.
Thanks, John. See you soon.
And thanks all for listening. We look forward to talking with you again soon.